A large group of organisms that cause human disease are the Salmonella, and these are grouped in the same genus, but it's a complicated situation where we just don't have a clear idea of how they came to be related to each other. One thing that reflects that is that we don't have really species names for Salmonella, or I should say the pathogens you will learn about don't really have unique species names. They're all Salmonella enterica. So that's their shared species name. So Salmonella enterica. But they're separated by what we call serovar. So it's like what we could tell about them using immunology tools. It doesn't matter what that means. The serovar is the grouping we use. And so in most cases, what you would see is the serovar name would not be italicized and it would be capitalized. So it's written differently from a species name, or it's supposed to be anyway. So if you see this Salmonella typhi, that is written correctly, whereas the species name should look like this. This is written correctly and this is written correctly. So these are gram negatives who are closely related to E. coli and shigella, and you'll see shigella later. And they probably should all be rearranged. As we learn more about reconstructing phylogeny, we're getting better ideas and better techniques all the time, and so sometime in your career, some of these names might change. That's really what I'm getting at. So the one I brought up, Salmonella typhi, is not really common in the U.S., but it is a big deal elsewhere, and that's because the disease it causes does have a lot of associated mortality, and because it's a good example of a pathogen that spreads using the fecal-oral route. So this causes a fever called typhoid fever, and that's the main thing people get, a severe fever. It doesn't show up necessarily as like a gastrointestinal disease. It doesn't primarily cause diarrhea or vomiting, but it causes the fever and abdominal pain because the bacteria escape from the gut. And so we get a body-wide immune system with things like fever. It certainly can cause other things, like it can attack the gut and cause things like dysentery, but a lot of its other complications involve what it does to the brain and what it does all over the body. You can take a vaccine to prevent this, but if you haven't had that vaccine, we have to think about these things, and I bring this up because this is a great example of these things that everyone should know. So Salmonella typhi has a small infective dose, and it is spread the fecal-oral route. So if you're living or traveling in a place where there isn't a good sewage treatment, so if people have to defecate outdoors or something like that, then this kind of disease can spread pretty quickly. What we have to think about is these things. It's kind of a weak mnemonic device, but it's the 5 Fs. And if you repeat this or rearrange it for yourself, you can remember the things to think about in this kind of situation. So flies are what spread the bacteria from feces most of the time. Flies can land on food, and it's not difficult at all for a fly to accidentally transfer this many, 10 to 1,000 bacteria after it lands on feces and then lands on food. It's easy to transfer that many cells. That's all there is to it. And people's fingers, if you touch a contaminated fomite, so this is an inanimate object that a fly might have landed on, and if you touch this, you can get this number of bacteria on your fingers quite easily. And if you then bring them to your mouth, you get infected. The larger dose you get, the faster the disease is going to happen. And so this is really how we should always be thinking about preventing fecal-oral diseases. So the first step is proper sanitation, so people aren't defecating outside. But then the other steps involve hand washing. Hand washing goes a long way. But if you're in a place where you don't have access to good sanitation, you still have to eat. And so the best thing to do is to clean your own hands and cook your food. So this is the thing to remember. Boil it, cook it, peel it, or forget it. Boil it is what you would do with water. Boiling water kills Salmonella. It kills Vibrio cholerae. It doesn't kill endospores, but that doesn't matter because most of the time water doesn't have a lot of the endospore-forming bacteria in it. So boiling water is very useful. It inactivates some viruses too. Cooking food, same thing. And then peeling, well, this refers to fruit. The inside of a fruit that has not yet been peeled is typically sterile. So the inside of a banana, the inside of an orange. So if you have access to one of these things, those foods are safe from this kind of pathogen. If not, they are not. So if you get like ice water in a restaurant, you can easily get an infection from that. Also, if someone, like the safest foods that I could think of are the ones that have been deep fried. But then if the person cooking them handles them, they're not safe anymore. So it's a tricky thing to avoid these diseases when you're in a place where they're spreading. Okay, so enough of that. The other thing about Salmonella typhi is that it famously causes chronic infections, and carriers will have a chronic infection in the gallbladder. So this is the mnemonic from the clinical microbiology book of the salmon, or Salmonella, hanging out in the gallbladder. So what we are much more likely to encounter in the U.S. is salmonellosis. And so these would be usually intestinal infections caused by different Salmonella strains. So there are multiple different Salmonella serovars that can cause these. And these are the ones we would think of as coming from chickens or meat, because they can grow in the guts of animals. In a lot of cases, these are going to be spread from food, but they can also, because they live in many different animals, but they can be spread in a family through the fecal-oral route. Typically, when we see the biggest numbers is when food gets contaminated in a factory. And what we're seeing again and again now is vegetables and other foods that are meant to be consumed raw, like things you'd expect to eat in a salad, get contaminated in a packaging facility, and then they're sent to several different states, and people in those states get a dangerous Salmonella infection. So what does this look like? Well, when a person gets one of these, they're typically going to see something much more significant than food poisoning. So they're going to be very sick for more like a week, and they may have to be hospitalized. So they'll have a fever, which you wouldn't get with food poisoning, and many days of diarrhea. Because in this case, it's not caused by a toxin that passes through the gut and is gone. It's caused by bacteria living in the gut, constantly releasing toxins and attacking the epithelium. And that's why I have both of these things here. Some of it is caused by bacteria irritating the epithelium, but they can also get into the epithelial cells and potentially cross into the tissues below. And that is why we would see fever, because some of them are getting into the blood and lymph. This one typically doesn't spread from animals. So we think most shigella grows only in people. And so it spreads from person to person. Shigella is named after the shiga toxin, which is named after the city in Japan where it was discovered. And basically, these bacteria release a toxin that kills colonocytes. And in some cases, allows the bacteria to escape from the gut, but in others, it just creates a very bad inflammatory situation. And so what a person would get from that inflammatory situation is the fever. But also, if the colonocytes and other cells in the large intestine are being killed in large numbers, some of the, well, it'll change basically how much mucus is produced, and some of the mucus layer will slough off, and so there will be mucus in the stools. So shigella, like a lot of other fecal-oral pathogens, is very easy to catch with a very low infectious dose. We would typically see this spreading in a daycare center, and it's also spread in the U.S. This is actually a sexually transmitted infection, because anal sex can easily spread a number of bacteria that size. And so outside the U.S., it is very dangerous because it can spread in much bigger outbreaks and cause dysentery, especially in children. And so if someone gets an infection like this, the primary risk is dehydration from all the diarrhea that happens. And so rehydration is the most important thing, followed by nutrition. So again, if the gut is being thoroughly irritated and emptying itself quickly, a person is not absorbing nutrition from their food. So nutrition, again, can help. And in cases like Salmonella and shigella and in the E. coli's we're going to see, these bacteria do grow in the gut. And so part of stopping one of these diseases is getting them out of the gut. And that can require antibiotics. And we do have antibiotics that can work for that. So in the next video, I'm going to introduce you to some of the E. coli strains that you've probably heard about in the news. And we'll see why some E. coli strains are very dangerous and others are not. So that'll be in the next video.